Charles Rodman Campbell was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary after spending 12 years on death row. But his road to the gallows started decades earlier in Clearview, Washington, with a grudge he couldn't let go and a justice system that let him slip through. On the morning of April 14, 1982, Charles woke up restless. He started drinking early, and by the time he reached his girlfriend Judith Dirk's house, he was already drunk. He sat there, barely listening, and drinking another six-pack of beers. His mind kept circling back to the woman who had testified against him years before, Renae Wicklund. He left Judith's place sometime after noon, grabbing a butcher knife from her kitchen before heading out the door. His next stop was a friend's house. He wanted something from her, control, maybe comfort, but Debbie told him no. Charles made a move on her anyway, pulling her to the floor while tugging at her clothes. But when she pushed him away, he backed down and left. But the rage didn't. That's when he made the drive to Clearview, to Renae's house. By 3 o'clock, he parked his red car in the woods and waited. From the tree line, he watched her house where it had all started years ago. The street was quiet. Children's toys sat in the yard. And inside was the woman who, years earlier, had stood in court and helped send him to prison for a violent assault. And he had never forgiven her for that. At around 3:30 p.m., he stepped out of the woods with the knife in his hand. He crept between bushes and fences, moving closer and waiting for the perfect moment. This was the day he would get his revenge. That afternoon, 41-year-old Renae had stayed home sick. Normally, she worked as a school financial aid consultant and accountant from home, but that day she hadn't been feeling well and spent most of the day in bed. Around 4:20 p.m., her 8-year-old daughter Shannah got home from school. A few minutes later, their neighbor Barbara Hendrickson knocked on the door. She had come to check on them, taking Renae's temperature, checking her blood pressure, and distracting little Shannah by making Jell-O in the kitchen so her mother could rest some more. But somewhere in that window, Charles slipped into the house. He went after Renae first. She was later found on the bedroom floor, naked, beaten, and assaulted. Her nose and jaw were broken, her chest was bruised, and she had been strangled. But that wasn't what had killed her. A 7-inch slice across her throat had cut both carotid arteries and left her bleeding out on the floor. Then he turned to Shannah. She had been attacked in the dining room and dragged into the bedroom, where she was forced to see her mother's body lying in a pool of blood. That's where Charles killed her, too. The wound across her neck was even longer than her mother's, 7.5 inches, so deep it nearly severed her head. Barbara, the neighbor who had just come over to help, was the last to die. She had been attacked near the dining room and tried to escape, but Charles caught her in the hallway. And like the others, her throat was cut clean and deliberate. She bled out on the floor before help ever had a chance to arrive. But that wasn't all. Before killing them, Charles had assaulted and beaten all three. And both Renae's and Barbara's earrings had been ripped from their ears and taken as some sick trophy. Then he stepped over their bodies and disappeared. When Barbara's husband, Donald, hadn't heard from her by 6:30, he walked next door to check in and stepped straight into a nightmare, finding his wife and neighbors all dead. Police arrived quickly, but it didn't take long to see this wasn't a robbery gone wrong or some random break-in. The level of violence made that clear. This was targeted, personal. And as investigators worked the scene, one name started coming up again. Because this wasn't the first time Renae had been attacked. 8 years earlier, she had survived an assault in that very same house. And the man behind it was Charles. Back in 1974, Renae had been outside doing some yard work in her front lawn while her baby Shannah, just 8 months old, was sleeping inside the house. It was a quiet day until a man stepped onto her property with a knife in his hand. It was Charles. He forced her back inside. Then, while holding the blade near her baby, he told her exactly what he wanted. And if she didn't comply, he said, he would kill the baby. Terrified, Renae did what he demanded, and when it was over, Charles walked out like nothing had happened. But Renae didn't stay silent. As soon as he was gone, she ran straight to her neighbor's house, Barbara's house, and called the police. For a while, nothing happened. The case went cold, and Charles had vanished. But 2 years later, in 1976, she saw his face again, this time in a police lineup. And she pointed him out without hesitation. At trial, Renae took the stand, and so did Barbara. They stood in front of the jury and told them exactly what happened. Charles was convicted of first-degree assault and sodomy, and he was sentenced to 3 concurrent prison terms totaling 40 years. In the years after the attack, Renae's life unraveled. The trauma of what happened took a toll, and her marriage to Jack Wicklund fell apart. She focused on raising Shannah alone, and she started an at-home accounting business to try to keep things steady. And for a while, it worked. Life began to feel safe again. Then Jack's life took a strange turn. In December 1977, he was found tied to a chair in his West Seattle home, with his body covered in third-degree burns. He told police that a stranger had broken in, tied him up, doused him in gasoline, and lit a match. He survived, barely, and spent months in recovery, wearing a rubber bodysuit to protect his skin. Then, 5 months later, Jack died when his car crashed into a tree. Police never determined whether it was an accident, something intentional, or something else entirely. The only thing clear was that people around Charles Campbell had a habit of ending up broken or gone. Meanwhile, Charles was serving his time at the Washington State Reformatory, where he racked up another list of violations. He had brewed his own alcohol using yeast he had stolen from the prison kitchen. He beat other inmates, one hard enough that he needed medical care. And he assaulted at least 2 other inmates behind bars and threatened to kill them if they ever talked. But that wasn't all. Charles also started sleeping with a prison substance abuse counselor, and when she turned up at work pregnant, questions were asked. She lost her job, and by October 1982, she had given birth to Charles's child, a son. In January 1979, a prison psychologist reviewed his case and found something even more troubling. The report described Charles as combative, antisocial, and totally detached from right and wrong. The psychologist wrote that Charles had declared war on society and saw everyone else as mindless nitwits out to get him. He called Charles conscienceless, dangerous, and incapable of caring about anyone but himself. But even with all that on paper and all the red flags inside those prison walls, the system gave him another chance. In June 1981, after being locked up for only 5 years, the parole board waived his mandatory sentence, making him eligible for a lower custody level. That fall, they moved him into a work-release facility in Monroe, Washington. Then, between Christmas 1981 and the first days of the new year, Charles' ex-wife came forward. She told the state that he had slipped away from the facility and raped her. But instead of returning him to prison, the state quietly transferred him to a different work-release program in Everett. And within 30 days, he had already broken the rules 4 more times. He was drinking, fighting, and even threatening people. But still, he wasn't sent back to prison, and he was allowed to stay in the program. Meanwhile, Renae thought Charles was locked away for 40 years. But what she didn't know was that his 3 sentences ran at the same time, meaning he would only serve time for the longest sentence. That meant one thing: he would be out early. And he was. She had no idea he was already walking free, no idea he might come back for her. But that's exactly what happened. Over the years, Charles hadn't forgotten about Renae and Barbara. In his mind, they were the reason he went to prison. He blamed them, hated them, and he wanted revenge. Since both women still lived in the same house they lived in at the time of the attack, it wasn't hard to find them. And he made Renae and everyone who stood by her pay for what they had done. Just days after the murders, Charles was arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He was assigned a lawyer and eventually pleaded not guilty. But the state didn't hesitate. By May 1982, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. And from the beginning, the state's case was devastating. Both Judith and Debbie testified, describing his behavior that day. They told about the beers, the knife, and the advances that were rejected. But they weren't the only ones. Renae's neighbors said they saw a red car parked in the woods around the time of the attack, and they said that they saw someone with his description lurking around their backyards. But the most chilling testimony came from 11-year-old Josette Fraze, who lived next door to Renae and Shannah. She told the court she saw a man with dark curly hair and a big kitchen knife sneaking through the bushes around 3:30 that afternoon. He wore a blue jacket with a yellow stripe. She watched him walk down a gravel road, and later, in court, she pointed to Charles from a lineup. That was the man she saw. Police had already seized a jacket like the one Josette described from Charles' room the day after the murders. But there was a problem. Months earlier, investigators had shown Josette that exact jacket, and she couldn't say for sure it was the one she remembered. That detail was never shared with the defense. Still, the jury had already heard enough, and the image of a man who hunted his victims in broad daylight had already taken hold, and the evidence didn't stop there. Inside the house, detectives found Renae's jewelry scattered on the ground, Charles's bloody fingerprint on a glass, and one of Shannah's earrings in his car. And when they arrested him, more of Renae's earrings were found in his pants pocket. At trial, Charles barely spoke, and he refused to testify. He sat there emotionless and unmoved even by the graphic photos of the crime scene. His attorneys argued that the police had tunnel vision, that they only focused on him and ignored other possible suspects. But the jury didn't see it that way. In November 1982, Charles was found guilty, and 1 month later, he was sentenced to death. While he sat on death row, his mother spoke out publicly. She said she still loved her son, but she believed he deserved the sentence he had been given. She told investigators that, in her words, it was inevitable. I never believed he was going to end up anywhere but the electric chair. She also shared disturbing memories from his past, including how he once adopted a pet dog for the sole purpose of sexually abusing it. Over the next 12 years, Charles sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal, trying to overturn the verdict. He claimed the hanging method was cruel and that he wasn't treated fairly, but the courts weren't persuaded. Every claim was rejected. Charles didn't pick a method, so the state chose for him. By default in 1994, it would be hanging. Charles became the last person in the state to die that way. The night before the execution, he refused to leave his cell and was pepper sprayed by staff. Hours later, they brought him his last meal: fish sticks, tossed green salad, scalloped potatoes, and a cherry tart. But he barely touched it. He spent his last moments speaking to a few people, including the former prison counselor and their son. When the moment came, Charles refused to walk. Prison officials said he couldn't or wouldn't stand on his own. So they strapped him to a backboard, and guards carried him to the gallows that way. Even then, he resisted in small ways. As they tried to pull the hood over his head, he kept twisting and shifting, trying to delay the inevitable. But once the hood dropped and the trapdoor opened, it was over. The drop came at exactly 12:08 a.m. on May 27, 1994. 6 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Charles Rodman Campbell was 39 years old. But this wasn't the end of it. Nearly 30 years after Charles was executed, another secret clawed its way out of the past. In 2023, detectives in Seattle quietly reopened a case that had sat untouched for almost 50 years. The 1975 murder of 25-year-old Hallie Ann Seaman. She had been a graduate student at the University of Washington, and she was last seen alive at her drafting table. The next afternoon, her body was found, hidden in the bushes off East Lake Avenue. She had been stabbed, assaulted, and left to die. Hours later, her car was discovered miles away, burned down to the frame. The case went cold quickly, and for nearly 50 years, Hallie's killer remained unknown. But then came the break. In 2023, investigators ran old DNA evidence from Hallie's body through modern forensic databases, and they finally got a hit. It matched Charles Rodman Campbell. It had been him all along. He had killed someone before Renae, before Shannah, and before Barbara. Hallie was likely his first, and no one had ever known. The evidence had always been there. It just took half a century and a future that could test DNA to prove what kind of man Charles really was.